In a world where physical distance and emotional disconnection had become so common that people had forgotten what true closeness felt like, there worked a bridge builder named Marcus who constructed something far more essential than spans of steel and concrete. Marcus built invisible bridges between hearts that had drifted apart, creating pathways that allowed love, understanding, and connection to flow across chasms of misunderstanding, geography, silence, and hurt. Marcus had discovered his extraordinary gift at age 17, during the worst period of his life when his parents' bitter divorce had turned him into a messenger shuttling between two people who refused to speak to each other directly. Exhausted by carrying anger and hurt between two homes, Marcus had stood one evening on an actual bridge overlooking the river that divided his town and made a desperate wish, that there could be some way to help people reach across the distances that separated them. The next morning, Marcus woke to find a strange set of blueprints spread across his desk, detailed plans for a bridge, but unlike any architectural drawing he had ever seen. The measurements weren't in feet or meters but in emotional units. The materials list included items like accumulated patience, weathered forgiveness, and compressed empathy. Somehow, Marcus understood exactly what these meant and how to work with them. His first bridge was built between his own parents. Marcus spent weeks gathering the necessary materials, moments when his mother had almost called his father but stopped herself, instances when his father had driven past their old house remembering happy times, words of kindness each had spoken about the other when they thought no one was listening. He wove these threads of lingering connection together, creating an invisible but powerful structure that began allowing genuine communication to flow again. The bridge wasn't instantaneous or magical in the fairy tale sense, it didn't erase hurt or resolve all conflicts. But it did something more important, it created a safe passage across which difficult conversations could travel, a structure strong enough to hold the weight of two people's pain without collapsing. Within months, Marcus's parents weren't reconciling romantically, but they were talking civilly, even warmly, rediscovering the friendship that had existed before and beneath their failed marriage. Word of Marcus's gift spread through the quiet channels that carry news of true magic, whispered recommendations, desperate referrals, the kind of organic discovery that happens when people genuinely need help. His services were sought by families fractured by old arguments, friends separated by misunderstandings, siblings divided by inheritance disputes, communities torn apart by conflicts that had calcified into permanent divisions. Marcus learned that every bridge required different materials and architecture. The bridge between a mother and her estranged adult daughter needed to be built primarily from acknowledgement stones, heavy, solid pieces created from moments when each woman had silently recognized her own contribution to their painful dynamic. These stones formed foundations strong enough to support the eventual crossing, even though years of resentment had eroded so much else. For elderly friends who had drifted apart not through conflict but through the simple entropy of busy lives and growing families, Marcus built bridges from remembered joy cables, thin, gleaming threads that recalled shared laughter, adventures, and the easy companionship of their younger years. These lightweight bridges didn't need to bear much weight, they just needed to remind both parties that the friendship had once been effortless and could be so again. The most challenging bridges Marcus built were those spanning distances created by death. Grieving people would come to him desperate to feel connected to loved ones who had passed away, and Marcus would explain gently that these bridges were different, they couldn't facilitate conversation or physical reunion, but they could create paths for love, memory, and influence to continue flowing between the living and the dead. For a widow who felt completely cut off from her late husband, Marcus built a bridge from legacy materials, the values her husband had modeled, the jokes he had told that she still repeated, the way he had looked at problems that she now found herself unconsciously imitating, the love for their children that continued expressing itself through her parenting choices. The bridge helped her recognize that her husband's presence hadn't ended but had transformed into something woven permanently into who she had become. Marcus discovered that some of the longest bridges needed to span cultural or ideological distances. He was called to communities divided by politics, by different understandings of tradition and progress, by competing visions of what their shared future should look like. These bridges required what Marcus called structural empathy, the ability to build support beams from each side's legitimate concerns and fears, creating a pathway that honored multiple truths simultaneously. In a neighborhood torn apart by a zoning dispute, Marcus built a bridge that allowed each faction to walk across and genuinely feel what the other side was experiencing: the longtime residents' fear of losing their community character, the newcomers' need for affordable housing, the developers' economic pressures, the young families' desperate search for belonging. The bridge didn't make everyone agree, but it created understanding sufficient for compromise. Marcus learned that not all bridges needed to be permanent structures. Some were temporary passages built specifically to allow one crucial conversation to happen, one necessary apology to be delivered, one important truth to be acknowledged. These temporary bridges would dissolve after serving their purpose, having done exactly what was needed without creating false expectations of ongoing connection. A man hired Marcus to build a temporary bridge to his dying father, with whom he had been estranged for 20 years. Marcus constructed it from urgency supports and mortality cables, the shared understanding that time had run out for grudges and that whatever needed to be said must be said now. The bridge lasted exactly long enough for 3 bedside visits where father and son spoke truths they had avoided for decades, achieving not perfect reconciliation but honest acknowledgement. When the father died, the bridge dissolved naturally, having completed its sacred purpose. Children required special bridge-building techniques. Marcus discovered that young people were simultaneously more wounded by disconnection and more capable of crossing bridges once they were built. For a teenager whose parents had divorced bitterly, Marcus built what he called a dual nationality bridge, a structure that allowed the teen to maintain authentic connection to both parents without feeling like a traitor to either, without having to choose sides or carry messages, without losing parts of herself in the crossing. Marcus's most innovative work involved building bridges within individuals, connecting parts of themselves that had become separated by trauma, shame, or dissociation. A woman who had survived abuse hired him to build a bridge between her present self and the child she had been when the abuse occurred, allowing compassion and protection to flow backward in time and strength and wisdom to flow forward, creating integration where there had been only fragmentation. The bridge builder learned that his most important tool wasn't in his construction techniques but in his ability to help people see that bridges were even possible. Many of his clients arrived believing that certain distances simply couldn't be crossed, that time, hurt, or fundamental differences had created permanent chasms. Marcus's first job was always to help them recognize that if even a thread of connection remained, a shared history, a common love, a mutual hope, he could work with it. Marcus discovered that the strongest bridges often incorporated materials that seemed like weaknesses: the vulnerability of admitted mistakes, the uncertainty of questions without answers, the humility of acknowledging one's own limitations. These flexible joints allowed bridges to sway with the weight of difficult truths without breaking, to accommodate ongoing growth and change in both parties rather than demanding they remain fixed in position. As word of Marcus's work spread internationally, he began building bridges across vast geographical distances, helping immigrant families maintain connection across oceans, assisting military families in staying close despite deployment separations. Connecting people whose work or circumstances required them to live far apart. These distance bridges required different engineering, more faith cables, and trust foundations to span the physical miles. Marcus was hired by an organization helping refugees reconnect with family members in war zones or displacement camps. These bridges had to be built across not just distance but trauma, uncertainty about survival, dramatically different daily realities, and the guilt that could separate survivors from those still in danger. The bridges Marcus built in these situations were lifelines in the most literal sense, proof that love and family connection could persist despite circumstances that seemed designed to destroy them. The bridge builder faced his greatest challenge when asked to help build a bridge in a community torn by historical trauma, descendants of people who had harmed others meeting descendants of those who had been harmed. Marcus understood that these bridges needed to be built from acknowledgement foundations, accountability supports, and repair materials, heavy, expensive resources that required enormous effort to gather in place. But when these bridges were successfully built, they could bear the weight of entire communities moving toward reconciliation. As Marcus aged, he began training others in bridge-building principles. He taught that the work required 3 essential qualities: the humility to recognize that you couldn't force connection, the patience to gather materials slowly and carefully, and the faith to believe that even the smallest thread could be woven into something strong enough to hold two hearts reaching toward each other. His students learned that bridge building wasn't about fixing or changing people, but about creating infrastructure that allowed their own better impulses to travel safely across whatever distances had opened between them. The bridges worked not through magic but through providing what relationships needed: safe passage for difficult truths, support for vulnerable attempts at connection, and pathways that made reaching out feel possible rather than impossibly dangerous. On Marcus's final project before retirement, he built his masterpiece, a bridge between a whole city's present and its future. Working with community leaders, activists, artists, and ordinary residents, he created a structure that connected people's current fears and divisions to a shared vision of what they could become together. The bridge incorporated materials from every demographic group, every neighborhood, every cultural tradition in the city, demonstrating that belonging and progress weren't opposing forces but complementary values that could support each other. The bridge builder who connected hearts across distances left behind a legacy encoded not in physical structures but in the countless relationships his work had helped restore, maintain, and create. He had taught people that distance, whether measured in miles, years, misunderstandings, or pain, was never the final word on connection, and that with enough patience, skill, and faith, bridges could be built across any chasm that hadn't been deliberately burned behind both parties, carrying love across gulfs that had seemed impossible to span.